Nothing is hotter than the debate about romantasy. Some people say it's too simple. Others say it is objectifying men. Some say it's just porn. And a lot of people argue it's not diverse enough. And there's so many opinions out there at the moment, it's really hard to keep track of who made which argument. And I honestly think it's one of those sad debates where it's love or hate. It's become one of these polarizing things where people have solemnly given up on the idea of critical reading. They've just decided that either you're in the love or in the hate camp. And honestly, I think that's a really sad testament because these are genuinely good stories, and I would say that a lot of fantasy books are very, very hard to write. It takes a lot of time to imagine these worlds, bring them alive, write these books, and then promote them and pitch them and query literary agents, and then for those literary agents to reach out to publications. It's a difficult and long process, and it's so sad that people would just be hating on something so intensely. I would say enjoy your own books at your own discretion. The only thing that I think is wrong is banning books, because that's historically never really led to anything good in this world. But yeah, I would encourage reading critically, and I give the authors the integrity that they deserve for their work. And I think there are many shades between hate and love. So here's a little help for those who want to sift through the hate and love situation and just find their golden middle on the debate of romantasy. So if you're new here, hi, and welcome to the Mugcast. This is a cozy listen to pair with your coffee. I'm Hannah, the writer behind Hug in a Mug on Medium, where I cover everything from music to psychology as a woman living abroad. And here on the podcast, I read my stories aloud and give you a few fresh reflections and insights along the way. So grab your mug, settle in, and let's get into today's piece. Okay, as mentioned, this is a very, very polarizing idea, the idea of romantasy as a whole. And I get it. There's a lot of things that are wrong with the genre and a lot of things that need change. But just because something is wrong about a domain doesn't mean you can suddenly hate on everything blatantly without having engaged with the actual subject matter. By the way, before we're jumping into the article, I want to say that I have dropped the link for the article that I'm going to be reading down below. If there's any links or resources that I'm mentioning, you can go click the link and access these things. And if you want to, you can also take notes in the article, or you can highlight things, or you can just basically read the original text if you want to. So the link for that is down below. I will now get into the actual piece that I've written, which is called Women Are Not Asking for Wings on Tinder. Is fairy smut sexual liberation for women or just creatively exaggerated porn? I enjoy reading romantasy, and I still have a dating life with real men. Surprise, surprise. All of that, even though there are actually people out there suggesting that women will, over time, fall victim to porn addiction and in the shape of winged abs. Sadly, I really don't see any evidence for that. What I see is that more women read these days, and they dare to pick up previously scary big books with many, many pages and big volumes. And most of these women that I've observed are becoming obsessed with not just romantasy, but reading in general. So they're reading many other kinds of genres as well. So despite the fact that there are certainly people out there who might only read fairy smut, I doubt it's the majority. Also, I want to highlight that a large female readership is nothing new historically, and neither is the dismissal of female written books as quote-unquote lower quality. The history I'm referring to here specifically is how, generally, romance novels have always been regarded as the lower class literature. Jane Austen's books were not regarded as high quality as those of her male counterparts, even though she had a readership, because female readerships of romance are considered not as quote-unquote elaborate as male readerships. Interestingly, similar things happened in completely different cultures. In South Korea, for instance, when the Hangul writing system was introduced, the majority of the rich Yangbang class men were still educated with the Chinese character writing system. And a lot of the novels and scriptures that they had were written in Chinese, or Chinese characters, I shall say. There was also books that were being written in Hangul, but these books were written by women as stories that are fiction stories. And a lot of these fiction stories, interestingly, and I dig these stories, I really love them. These are Joseon Dynasty stories written by women where a female hero was running through the arc that normally a male hero would run through. I have a different article on this called The Female Heroine's Journey. That's one of the articles I want to read next because it's deeply insightful. Basically, they would write fiction novels in Hangul and then they would put a female into the male's shoes, which is a very interesting thing to do. And many women would read that. But generally, societally, these novels or stories, they were dismissed as being lower quality because they weren't written in Chinese. Specifically, these were fiction novels, and the Chinese character ones that the men were reading were real historic evidence, quote unquote. And so they were more worthy and more important to read, and the fiction that the women were creating and reading wasn't important. So that's what I mean by large female readerships are nothing new historically. They totally are not. And neither is their dismissal. When women write for women, these stories are easily dismissed, is basically the point that I'm making. But I'm capable of reading critically, and thus there are some traits of Romantasy books that I would like to see evolve, for sure, because literature is all about creative evolution. Honestly, since this is becoming more and more of a discussion online, I think the genre will become more experimental quite automatically, because publishing is also just another domain that is reliant on marketing and audiences. And if the audience is shifting, so does the material. So I think we're naturally going to see more diversity in the books as the audience starts to demand that. But since everyone seems to hate Romantasy to death recently, here's a little insight from a reader who refuses to pick sides. Yes, I like gray areas and not just in 50 Shades. At this point, I want to quickly shout out another video that you might want to reference if you're listening to this. It's by Plant-Based Bride, who is a really, really famous reviewer of books. She's a very interesting YouTuber. I've been following her for years. And recently, she's done a video on Romantasy. She's more critical in terms of the gender diversity, which I find very interesting and very revealing. And I found that video amazing. So if you want somebody to roll out for you all of the things that people are critiquing and all of the arguments that are being brought forward, I would recommend you to check out that video. I did find it super interesting, and I do agree with what she's saying. Again, I'm not just praising Romantasy to be the best novels. I'm just saying there's a lot of arguments to be had, and I, for my part, want to reserve the ability to still value the authors and their work. I've recently also heard an interesting take that Romantasy will die if it doesn't change. And the speaker in that video added, and I quote here, "Depending on whether it gets a movie or series adaptation, Romantasy might stick around for 1 or 2 more decades." That's what this reader was suggesting. And I honestly agree with that. If there were cinematographic adaptations of these bestseller list ranked novels and series like Fourth Wing or Akotar or Crescent City or just the ones on top of my head, that would certainly help the genre survive, even with the existing hate that it's now facing. These are not just critiques, because there's a difference between hate and a critique. Recently, Sarah J. Maas stopped her contract to produce A Court of Thorns and Roses as a series, which was really surprising and sad to me because I would have loved to see that as a series. Apparently, the discontinuation was due to budgeting issues, which is honestly kind of funny to me because why is it that a book with such a large readership cannot be financed? I get it. This is a fantasy series. It demands a larger production budget for sure. It's not just some high school drama. But we have highly advanced CGI technologies these days, and there's AI very widely available, much of which is already circulating in snippets online by amateur AI video creators already. You can now catch glimpses of the Bisgayeth War College from Fourth Wing on Instagram. So why is it so impossible to gather the money for a multi-million engaged fan base? Apparently, fairy wings don't get tax incentives. And I want to shout out a lot of the amazing Instagram art or Pinterest art that I've seen. If you just go on Pinterest and you type in Fourth Wing, or I sadly don't remember the name of this one Instagram AI artist that I've seen, but she's amazing. She basically creates these videos where you walk through Crescent City, for instance. She has a video that follows one of the little otters who are delivering mail. I mean, that's what somebody made in their home office, in their bed, maybe on their home computer. I honestly think this is fishy. And something tells me the lack of success in securing a company to produce this series in a financially possible way has to do with the fact that we're talking about female writers here. We're talking about a female fan base and a female made series and movies. And that might, for the first time, objectify men. Romantasy is not new, but objectified men are. The hilarious thing is that romantasy hasn't even been around for so long, and yet people already predict its downfall, when most men who jump into these conclusions online have never even touched the actual books. I was personally insulted and attacked for merely commenting. Under another woman's post, I just said that I also like romantasy. And by 5 minutes later, I had 5 men jump at me when I had barely 20 followers to actually see that post. I was called sexually frustrated and forever single in the same line of argumentation as I was characterized as both a slut for reading books and not enough of a reader at the same time. It was, in a way, quite fascinating. The idea of paranormal romances in the 21st century, because it certainly existed before that, but couldn't reach the mainstream, was popularized first through everyone's second most favorite hate book, Twilight. This is another example of a female written book that's been taken down for being not feminist enough and portraying a disturbing relationship. But let me tell you a secret. The reason behind the story is usually the societal constructs around the author. They don't spark magically in a woman's brain. Twilight was written by Stephanie Meyer, a young mother at the time, who had married at 21 right before finishing her degree in English literature, and she was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Maybe, just maybe, she wrote a story that was set in a fantasy, but very reflective of her societal expectations. Also, Twilight famously originated from one of her dreams. And I've been talking about that in my last podcast episode. If you're curious, I was talking about dream psychology, explaining how one could read their dreams, explaining why writing about a dream is not revolutionary. And I was explaining why no one can dream a matriarchy. So if you're curious, you can jump back to that episode. As someone who avidly records and works on herself through dreams and psychoanalysis, I can tell you that your dreams are maybe very far from fantastical, but certainly they're more truth adjacent and a replay of your lived reality. And with her background, Stephanie Meyer's background, maybe the relationship she wrote about was realistic, despite the blood draining being a little bit out of sync. I can attest to you that if I wrote a book about my recent dreams, it wouldn't be a revolutionary feminist novel. To do that, one needs to conduct a lot of extraordinary mental experiments and maybe be on hard drugs. So unfortunately, one must set out to write a feminist book and do research. It doesn't just happen, and it doesn't happen in our current society especially. Fantasy and romance are not new, but the audience is. So the idea of mainstream paranormal romance sparked in 2005 with the release of Twilight, though again, they have existed far before that. Twilight had a female lead that admittedly had very questionable advocacy. I still loved Twilight at the time because as I read Bella's story, I had zero advocacy for myself because I was a teenager, and so I kind of related to her. Stephanie Meyer couldn't be more predatory to me than the society surrounding me, in all honesty. Now, I have an interesting nostalgia around the Forest of Forks. Maybe because my family home in Austria is also a mini Forks, and I've had a soft spot for vampires and blood due to very frequent nosebleeds. That's very TMI. Anyways, after Twilight, the word romantasy first appeared in 2008 when fan communities started tossing around this new piece of jargon. And in 2015, the first book of Court of Thorns and Roses was released, and soon after that, all hell broke loose. The fame was proliferated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially in 2022 and 2023, the fandom around fairy smut soared into new heights. There was the hashtag Bookstagram and hashtag BookTalk, which went viral and were all the rage. And the Fourth Wing saga was published in these years as well and sparked amazing debate and made it to bestseller lists everywhere. Now, we have many sagas like this who are all fantasies, but they don't entirely lack creativity in my mind. There's Sarah J. Maas, who writes about Lord of the Rings themed worlds like Akotar or A Throne of Glass, and she produces the utopian detective murder fantasy Crescent City, which is what I'm reading right now. Rebecca Yarros is kind of the George R. R. Martin of romantasy, I would say. as she's writing Fourth Wing, and there's also a somewhat funky Crave series by Tracy Wolff, which is a spin-off of the Twilight Saga, but with different intentions. I've personally read, I think I stopped at book 3 or something. I wouldn't say it's the most amazing read I've had of my life, but I will say I had a lot of fun reading it because the way it is written, it just feels like the author had a lot of fun. Is it reasonable and is it an amazing piece of literature? I doubt it, but it's hilarious. It's very funny. There's also The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, which I really like. And it gets deep into the fairy lore, whereas The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent takes vampires into the Hunger Games. This is another series I really enjoy, The Serpent and the Wings of Night. There's also the Powerless series by Lauren Roberts, and it plays with the idea of forbidden love. And then there's Hades and Persephone series, which is written by Scarlett St. Clair. It's basically a Greek mythology retelling, and Scarlett St. Clair also did other ancient tales with a sort of sexy spin. I personally have read the Hades and Persephone series. It's one of those novels, again, where I'd be like, is it the most amazing book I've ever read? Probably not. But is it very entertaining? Yes, and I think that has its merits. So I think it does a good job at introducing the Greek mythology, but of course it transports it into modern day settings, so it's not 100% blatantly accurate, which makes it fun. So honestly, there's a lot of variety in my eyes, and yet people criticize the tropes for being too easy, too repetitive, and sometimes they're even framed as dangerous. I will not lie. I love that these books exist now because while I enjoyed The Hunger Games when they came out and I enjoyed Divergent a lot, Divergent was my favorite, and I also enjoyed Twilight, they were clearly only the first steps into an uncharted territory for mainstream audiences outside of the US especially. However, I do admit that the 50th mating bond isn't really my center of interest, and I also critique this play with the protector role that so many of these novels are using as the main internal conflict for their male leads. I really think there's more to a man than, I want to protect, but this woman is so strong. At this point, I'm really cringing over it. Is it realistic that these men know exactly how to pleasure the female main character immediately? No. But as someone who grew up with many sex scenes, I can say that these book chapters are more female-centric, at least in most movie sex that I've seen. And again, I don't talk about thunder during the orgasm here. I'm talking about reality applicable details. And if I'm being honest, I think it's a good thing that these novels helped remove the stigma from women engaging in pleasure. Female pleasure in novels is far from a new idea. But just because it's not new doesn't make it just as important. Because many new gems in literature unfortunately stay in the literature bubble amongst those who are really into books, and they never make it into the mainstream discussion. So I guess one could say that first there is an artistic and advocative writing, and then second, years if not decades later, comes the mainstream success of that very same concept. That's just a thing. That's like a pioneer spirit. If people are making this like argument that this has existed before, like Romantasy is not the first to do XY, completely true. There's always been a book that did it before, and there can always be a discussion about whether that book before did it better. True, 100%, agreed. But the fact is that what Romantasy did is it's the first time that that came into the mainstream in such an extreme way. It's the first time that these novels not only landed on bestseller pages, but went viral and created book talk. That hasn't happened before. So I think it's still valid for these books to talk about female pleasure, because before it wasn't in the mainstream. There is a demand for it on one hand, and there's a need for it. Basically, the point I want to make is society moves slowly, arts moves faster, and so sadly, arts will be ahead. The most artistic of novels will be years ahead from the mainstream novels reaching success. Sex ed and female pleasure are still separate categories. I will give you a funny example from a young adult's life. I grew up with high school-centered movies where there would be scenes of a boy being caught watching porn, or a shot where you would see tissues around his bed, indicating that he had, done things. Thus, if my mom were to discover condoms or tissues in my brother's bedroom, that would have been a smirking matter. Somehow, girls' self-pleasure was never part of any movie narratives in my teens. So when I discovered my body, all I had to reference are my friends, who are also girls, around me, and we all were in this same phase of life, utterly lacking any guidance. Mind you, I'm talking about the 21st century and teenagehood in the 21st century here. What I got instead of movie representation was an extra lesson on fertility, especially guidance on how to deal with periods, because I grew up in a very open-minded society already. Luckily, I'm very happy and grateful for that. And lots of my sex ed basically featured all the ways that a woman could prevent getting pregnant. I'm not saying that sex ed needs to feature self-pleasure, that's not my point, but I think there is a weird imbalance in the mechanisms of male pleasure and how they're displayed versus the female ones. And it doesn't have to do with sex ed, it has more to do with the media. Male self-pleasure is very obvious and very blasted across media and movies and others. But female self-pleasure was more a difficult thing to find. I watched Sex in the City for my sex ed at home, which is a genius idea by my parents. Thank you, by the way. But it was like a world far away from mine, not only as a girl living in Austria and those women literally walking the streets of New York. It was like a world for quote unquote real women. And it led me to understand the theory, which I'm very grateful for, but still with kind of a label of distaste and judgment to it. I realized as I grew older what these jokes of the adults were about when they talked about bees and chickens and whatever other animals of opposing genders and touching body parts. But I will say, I wouldn't see my mom cracking those jokes. But rather, it would be like the men in the room that would crack those more touchy jokes. So I also felt like, okay, my parents, my mom, the women around me who are women I look up to, they're not making these jokes. It's the men who are making the jokes. And the women laugh, but they don't make the joke. So I was lucky I got a lot of sex ed when I grew up. But the point I'm trying to make is the narrative behind the sex ed that I received, which is so great and advanced and much better than what people got before me, but there's still improvements to be made, you know? The idea was still to primarily ensure that women don't get pregnant, and it was the idea of you can have fun, but make sure you're safe. For God's sake, make sure you're safe. And one thing I stumbled upon as I dig deeper into the narrative behind how male pleasure is portrayed on screens and how female pleasure is portrayed on screens, I found out female pleasure is always somewhere in the function of love. Any woman I've ever watched having an orgasm was either in the presence of a man or because she was thinking about a man, usually about someone who would in the future be her boyfriend in the storyline. So emotional love was tied to pleasure for women in a way that it wasn't for men. And having sex like a man, quote unquote, in the way that Samantha does it in Sex in the City was not really the ideal. And that is, I think, what we now characterize as the weakness of romantasy today. These stories are highlighting female pleasure, but within the constraints of a loving and lasting relationship. I actually think this is one of the things that made the Akotar series so famous, because the first love interest of the main character wasn't the eternal one. She had good sex with another man first, but somehow the sex with the second one had to be better, because female pleasure gets better with love, supposedly. Despite a lack of evidence, I can't help but say that a small part of my societal indoctrinated brain hopes that that is true. This is really something that I found very revealing. The fact that female pleasure is a function of love. Male pleasure is a function of joy. Pleasure itself. It's in itself fulfilling. The pleasure arc of a man can be done when he's throwing away the tissues into the trash. The female pleasure arc is done when she gets married or when she eventually ends up with the guy. That's still, sending a message. So I guess the 21st century woman wants the sex of true love and not the kiss of true love like we did in old fairy tales. Men writing fantasy can use sex as a marketable addition because they use sex as a plot device or as a character embellishment. Now we dive into some characters that I personally love, and yet I can't unsee the things that I'm going to say. So, Jaime Lannister from Game of Thrones has the ability to sleep with his sister very early on, so I'm not revealing anything crazy here. And he's also at the same time able to sleep with any number of prostitutes. And this kind of gives him credibility. This gives him part of his character. This is also true for Tyrion Lannister, by the way, whose whole repertoire of jokes in season 1 circles around the idea of dick sizes. This all is a bit primitive, but it sells pretty damn well. And look, I love Game of Thrones, but I can't help but notice the extreme use of prostitution and their sexual abuse under the shield of historic accuracy in these novels too. And I want to repeat, the shield of historic accuracy, because I think the White Walkers were a choice. And so the prostitutes were also a choice, because this is still a fantasy novel. You don't need prostitution in a medieval fantasy for it to seem like it's really medieval. It would have been sufficient to create the medieval surroundings without the prostitution, and people would still have recognized it as a medieval fantasy. Yet the turning point of, very interestingly, most of the female characters in Game of Thrones is actually abuse. And that kind of made me a little bit sad, because I really love these characters, but it's a little bit sad to see them that way. Best example would probably be Sansa Stark. She starts as this like bratty girl, and then the abuse happens. And after the abuse, she's the badass slay queen. Strong female characters in Game of Thrones, when they finally fall in love, that's their turning point. Even my most beloved Daenerys Targaryen, the moment she falls in love, she dies. Most of the love stories that women experience in Game of Thrones become either their worst nightmare and character turning point, or the best that's ever happened to them, and thus they subsequently quickly die, because George R.R. Martin never does his readership the joy of having a happy character. Why is it that the male characters in the story don't have to always change through a relationship? As a huge fan of Game of Thrones, it made me a bit sad to realize that actually I truly love Sansa, and she would be such a role model, but I don't want to need to ever relate to her story. As a boy, you could be taking characters from Game of Thrones and think, oh, that's a role model, I want to act like that person. Since Game of Thrones is not porn, I propose fairy smut isn't either. Honestly, I think at least 70% of the sex in Game of Thrones is for marketing purposes. I said it. Maybe 20% is actually necessary in terms of plot. And then there's 10% of the love scenes that are actually appearing in the way that they would in a romantasy novel. It's actually interesting that George R.R. Martin has amazingly few sex scenes that don't originate in assault, which is the drivers of the plot. His male characters frequently rape women or crack jokes about rape, or anything else related to sex, but the magnetic type of sex, the type that is so often the literal and physical climax of a female-written romance, actually rarely appears in his books. In Romantasy, characters can sleep with someone else beside their primary love interest, but it's rather rare. Bryce in Crescent City, for instance, sleeps around with people at parties before she meets the main male character. Fairy in Akatar famously has a whole book before finding her mate, Rysand. The female main character of The Cruel Prince also has several encounters before determining her attraction, but these are usually very few encounters, and they're at the beginning of the book or the series. Almost like a distraction to keep the reader guessing for a few more pages who might now actually become the real love interest, the real quote-unquote mate. I admit, I really deeply hate that word. I love that self-pleasure is becoming a thing for some BookTok novels very, very slowly. I'm seeing it because it allows for another way to play with the character's dynamic and gives the women more agency. What I'm still seeing in this book sometimes is there's a lack of self-pleasure, and I don't mean that suddenly I want everybody to engage in these sorts of activities by themselves at night. No, I don't think it's necessary. If it doesn't drive the plot, please don't. But I do think that at some point, especially for a strong female main character, as they love to say, it would make sense to include that as a plot device, as kind of one of those moments where the character gains agency. Just planting that idea that maybe that would be actually kind of useful to the plot. Though most of these females, quote unquote, that's the word they keep using for some reason, are strong characters. One thing remains true about them: the story. would not exist without their men. And that is the main hinge of my critique about these novels, which is a bit confusing because we're talking about romantasies, meaning a romance novel plus a fantasy. So it's literally in the name. They are written with relationships in mind. But I do argue that the dependency and protection ratio in these books could be lowered. At the same time, one thing I find eternally beautiful about Romantasy is that it's actually marrying this kind of roughness of a hero's arc with the softness of a romance. I find it beautiful to have the integration of the masculine and the feminine elements, the animus and the anima. If you've heard me before, you will be sick of that topic already because I say it so much. It is what makes books good to me. It's quite central to the current debate about feminism for me, and I just think it's beautiful when we can have a book where people are being slaughtered, and in the same book we also have a unicorn or an otter or something cute happen. It kind of takes away from this really toxic narrative of the men and the woman. And I want to say this is one of those feminist endeavors that actually kind of also a lot aids men, because a man in a book who can talk about a unicorn and awe at how pretty it is also allows men in real life to be a little more soft and to let go of these like strict rules that they have to be oh so strong and oh so dark. But more on this debate on feminism and how the female and male are playing together in romantasy novels in another episode, because this is already too long. Until then, I can only agree with this creator who perfectly summarized what I guess are most female readers' sentiments about wanting a morally gray shadow daddy in their real life. What I'm referring to here is a reel by Elizabeth Wheatley. If you click into the article, you will be able to watch the reel. Basically what she's saying is, she's being interviewed and the person is saying like, oh, you love romantasy, so for sure you also want a morally gray shadow daddy. And she's like, nope, that will not help me. He will not wash the dishes. He will not like be kind to me when I need it. He will not pick me up 10 times a day. He will not be emotionally engaging with me, because that's pretty much the opposite of the morally gray shadow daddy. So basically what she's saying is, no, I really like my little floof, her small little floof, she calls him. She likes her husband just the way he is, and she doesn't need a morally gray shadow daddy. And I think most romantasy readers will agree with that, which is the entire sentiment of this article. Women are not looking for wings on Tinder. We are just reading books, okay? And let us do that in peace. Thank you for granting me access to your ears on the Mugcast. You can read more of my writing on Medium under Hannah's Cafe or Hug in a Mug, and follow me on Instagram via hugin.amug for cozy content and updates. You can also check out my threads, by the way. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to follow the podcast and share it with fellow coffee lovers, and let me know in the comments which topic I should tackle next. I hope you had a nice cappuccino with this episode, and I'm sending a warm hug from my mug to yours. See you soon somewhere on Hannah's Cafe.